Hello and welcome to this Level 3 Anatomy and Physiology for Exercise and Health recorded webinar for CMS fitness courses. The aim of this webinar is to support you with your revision and the sitting of your Level 3 Anatomy and Physiology exam. So hopefully you've accessed your PDF manuals, you've completed the interactive e-learning, there's some knowledge checkers for you to complete to check your knowledge and understanding. And finally, this should be the final piece of the revision before you sit the mock exam, and then you attend to sit your anatomy and physiology exam. So, first thing we're going to look at is the heart and the circulatory system. So, when revising the heart, a good way to remember it is to think of having 4 chambers, 4 vessels, and 4 valves. If you can start to remember and regurgitate these 4, 4 and 4, then hopefully the flow and the structure of the blood flow will then start to follow. So to begin with, we've got 4 chambers, and when we look at the heart, we have to imagine that you're wearing the heart. So imagine if you turn your laptop around now, or you turn your tablet or your phone round and place it against your body and look down, then that would be your right hand side, so it's almost in flip reverse. So that's your what you call your right atrium, that's your left atrium, that's your right ventricle, and that's your left ventricle. Going into each of these chambers are different vessels. So we've got a vessel here, vessel there, vessel there, vessel there. The vessel going into the right atrium is what you call your vena cava. You can have a superior and an inferior vena cava. All that means is you've got one vessel coming down from the top into the vena cava and one vessel that's coming from the bottom up. So the superior is the one that's above and the inferior is the one that's below. All that means really is that the superior vena cava brings blood down from your shoulders and your brain, whereas the inferior vena cava will bring the blood back from the rest of your body. You've then got a vessel going out of your right ventricle, so that's what we call a pulmonary artery. So if a vessel is leaving the heart, like the pulmonary artery is, the vessel will be an artery. That's because when blood is leaving the heart under high pressure, it needs to be transported in a strong enough vessel. So arteries are quite muscular walled, they're strong enough to withstand the pressure of the heart beating, and therefore whenever a vessel is leaving the heart, it will be an artery. Whereas when the blood is coming back, so for example when the blood is coming back to the heart via the pulmonary vein, then that would be a vein as it's coming back under low pressure, just like the vena cava brings blood back under low pressure, so that's also a vein. Whereas the pulmonary artery and the 4th vessel, what you call the aorta, are both arteries. And in particular your aorta is the biggest artery you have, as it's where the most pressure is when that blood is leaving your heart, so it can then pump that blood up your carotid arteries, down your brachial arteries, down your femoral arteries, and obviously transport it to all areas of your body. So if we're thinking of the flow of blood around the heart, first of all we have what you call deoxygenated blood coming from the body. So this is blood which has been pumped around the body, we've taken oxygen out of it, and it needs to go back to the lungs. So like we said, it's coming back from either the superior or the inferior vena cava. It goes into the right atrium. The right atrium will fill up and eventually will pump blood from the right atrium into the right ventricle. And when it does this, it goes through a valve. The aim of the valve is to stop the backflow of blood, because we don't want blood flowing from the ventricle into the atrium. We want it to flow from the atrium into the ventricle, so it stops the backflow of blood. And a name for that ventricle is your atrioventricular valve, because it's where your atrium and your ventricle meet. However, you can have more specific names, so in particular the atrioventricular valve on the right hand side is called your tricuspid valve. So a way to remember that is that the tricuspid valve, which has the letter R in it, is on the right hand side. Once the blood flows into the right ventricle, it will start to build up pressure until it wants to pump out of the pulmonary artery. But when that does happen, again, there is a valve there, and this is known as either the pulmonary valve or the semilunar valve. and once the blood has left there, it goes to the lungs. At the lungs is where we have gaseous exchange or diffusion, where we get rid of carbon dioxide and we pick up oxygen, and the blood will then start to come back from the lungs via the pulmonary vein and go into the left atrium. Again, the blood will want to pump from the left atrium into the left ventricle, so we've got an atrioventricular valve again, but the one on the left can also be known as a bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. Once the blood goes into the left ventricle, it will pump out via the aorta, and again this can be called either the aortic valve or it can also be known as a semilunar valve. And then once it leaves the aorta, the oxygenated blood will go to the rest of the body. So hopefully if you can kind of draw the 4 chambers, draw the 4 vessels, put in the 4 valves and just start to name them, start with the simpler names, hopefully like the atrioventricular valve, hopefully the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve are more simpler ways to remember as you're putting the name valve on the end of the vessel. But if you can draw that kind of system, that structure, then hopefully you're nailing part of the names of the heart as well as the flow of the blood as well. So during exercise, what happens to the heart? So first of all, you have what you call a pre-workout anticipatory increase in your heart rate. So if you start to walk, or you get to the gym and you start to get changed and you're going to participate in some sort of exercise, then your body anticipates this and you'll start to get an increase in your heart rate, in your breathing rate, in your blood pressure to kind of get you ready for the exercise that's about to occur. During exercise, your coronary blood flow can increase from anything from 250 centimetres cubed to 1,000 centimetre cubed. So the actual amount of blood that is leaving your heart and going back into your heart to feed your heart will increase 4-fold. Your heart rate will increase, your stroke volume will increase, and if you times your heart rate by your stroke volume, you have what you call your cardiac output, and that can increase from a resting rate of 5 litres per minute to anything up to 20 to even 40 litres per minute, depending on how hard you're training and how fit you are. If you continue to exercise, there is something what you call cardiac drift. So cardiac drift is when normally it can occur around 30 minutes, but again it depends on how fit you are and how well nourished and hydrated you are, I suppose. But what happens if you're working at a steady rate of 150 beats per minute, after about 20, 25, 30 minutes, your heart rate will slowly start to go from 150 to maybe 152, 154, 156. And it's just a sign that your body's starting to fatigue, and it's not necessarily your heart that's fatiguing and is therefore having to work harder. It's other factors such as dehydration, glycogen depletion, just the uses of all your kind of your energy that you're using during exercise will start to deplete, and therefore your heart has to start working faster and harder to make sure that you can still provide oxygen and nutrients to the working muscles. And obviously at some point that can become a limiting factor. And then finally, once you've stopped exercising, your heart rate should then return to normal after exercise, and generally the fitter you are, the quicker your heart rate will return to normal after exercise. So that's short-term adaptations. That's if you were to walk into the gym right now and start to do some exercise. The benefit of that long-term is you'll have a stronger heart, therefore you have a slower heart rate, you have a lower resting heart rate, and that's a strong indicative sign of good heart health, good cardiovascular health. You'll be pumping more blood per beat, so you'll have an increased stroke volume, and what those together potentially mean is that you'll have an increased cardiac output capacity or capability. So you'll have an ability to either work either at the same intensity and it will feel easier, or you'll be able to work at a harder intensity and it will feel the same. So essentially you're getting fitter. You can either do the same stuff and it feels easier, or you can work harder but it won't feel as hard. And like we said earlier, you'll also recover quicker from the exercise. So whether that's session to session, or if you're doing some sort of interval training and stuff like that, then you'll recover quicker as well. And it's obviously also important just to consider the benefits of that in terms of having a healthier heart, that we're able to live not just longer, but also have a better quality of life as you do go into older age and stuff. So hopefully it's not just about fitness and performance, it's about the health benefits of working the heart as well. So while we're looking at the heart, we can also look at blood pressure. So an optimal blood pressure is less than 120/80. So we normally say we want to be aiming for 120/80. You know, if somebody was 110/70, then they would still be in that optimal blood pressure range. And generally, the lower your blood pressure, the better. It can get too low though, so you can see at the top 100/60. If your blood pressure ever goes below 100/60, then you'll be classed as having low blood pressure or hypotension. But most people don't achieve optimal. Most people are normal, so most people are around 130/85, and that's indicative of, you know, the general population being overweight, not being as physically active as what we should be, and therefore having a relatively high blood pressure. However, it's not classed as high blood pressure until you get to 140/90. So once you do get 140/90, that is when you're then diagnosed with stage 1 hypertension or high blood pressure. And generally, as the blood pressure increases, there can be worse consequences. So you can develop into stage 2 and potentially even stage 3. It's worth noting that at most organisations, once a client does get 140/90, it normally would be a case where you would need to refer them to a GP or to another personal trainer who's got the GP or exercise referral qualification, as it would be classed as a special population. So linking to blood pressure, there's something called vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So vasodilation is the opening of vessels to increase the flow of blood. So for example, the opening of arteries, arterioles and capillaries to the working muscles when you're running. So vasodilation is essentially the opening of your vessels that will increase blood flow. So think when you're running on the treadmill, you need to get an increased amount of blood flow, increased oxygen, increased energy to those working muscles. Your arteries will pump blood towards those working muscles. The arterioles will start to open up and absorb some of that blood from the arteries, ultimately resulting in the blood being in your capillaries, where it can then drop off the oxygen, pick up the carbon dioxide and start to transport the used blood back and start to replenish it. The opposite to vasodilation is vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction is the closing of vessels to decrease the flow of blood. An example of this would be the closing of arteries, the closing of arterioles, and the closing of capillaries to the digestive system when you're running. Normally, when you're running, you're not eating, so your body will then start to want to give as much working blood, give as much blood to the working muscles as possible. So it will shut down the flow of blood to your digestive system, because generally it's not needed, and therefore you've got more blood and more oxygen carrying capacity going to your working muscles. Another way of thinking of vasodilation and vasoconstriction is when you're cold. So if you're really cold and you're outside, your body will vasoconstrict to your fingers and to your ears, your peripheries, as it will want to vasodilate and pump all the blood towards your major organs, because it needs to make sure you survive. So it wants all the blood going to your major organs, and it will vasoconstrict to your fingers and your ears, as it couldn't afford to, if really needed, to lose a finger or something like that. The moving of blood like this is also known as blood shunting. So it just shows how your body is able to shut down and open up different parts of your blood circulatory system. So it's not a kind of constant circuit or loop like a plumbing circuit or anything like that. It can close and open at different parts. And there are benefits to being able to do that as well, in terms of good circulation, the benefits of vasodilation in regards to a positive effect on blood pressure as well. So muscles, when we're looking at muscles, that you can have different types or categories. You can have skeletal muscle, which is generally known as striated muscle. So what that means is they are striated in appearance. You can almost see the fibres of a muscle. If you ever look at someone who's really lean, you can almost see the individual fibres. Skeletal muscles are generally used for movement because they connect to the skeletal system and help us move. And they are generally voluntary, so we tell ourselves to go walk or pick something up. Whereas your smooth muscles are smooth because they're smooth. They're generally found in the digestive system and in your blood vessels, and they are involuntary. So when you eat an apple or you eat a banana, you don't tell your digestive system to contract that food and move it down your digestive system. It just does it involuntary without you having to tell it. And then finally, the third muscle type is your cardiac muscle, so your heart. What's unique about the heart is it never fatigues. Other parts of your body will fatigue, so your muscular system or your energy systems, or you become dehydrated before your heart fatigues. Because generally, once your heart has fatigued, then you'll be kaput. It's 100% aerobic, so it feeds itself blood supply all the time. If that blood supply ever gets affected, such as due to cardiovascular disease, then it would lead to angina, so chest pains, and ultimately eventually lead to a heart attack. And again, this heart muscle is involuntary. We might tell ourselves to go for a walk, so we're using our voluntary skeletal muscles, but our heart will, without asking, start to increase the heart rate, start to increase blood flow based on our decision to go for a walk. So if we look at skeletal muscles in a little bit more detail, the structure of a skeletal muscle is, first of all, you have this what you call an outer fascia called your epimysium. So epi generally means higher or above. So you've got this higher or outer fascia that wraps around the whole of your muscle. Within that large fascia, there's what you call a fasciculi. So a fasciculi is a bundle of fibres, and you then have another fascia called your perimysium. Inside your perimysium, you then have an individual muscle fibre that is made up of smaller fibres, but those smaller fibres also have a wire or a fascia wrapped around it, called your endomysium. And in that endomysium, you then have a myofibril. So that's like an individual muscle fibre, and each individual muscle fibre is made up of myofilaments called actin and myosin, and they are separated along the length of muscle called a sarcomere. So in this example here, your actin are your fin filaments, so they're actin fin, whereas your myosin are your mighty myosin, as they're bigger in appearance. If we just look at the image there, if you think of the electricity cable or an electricity cable, if there's an electricity cable connecting your laptop to a mains outlet or any sort of electricity cable, your muscle has a kind of similar structure. So you've got the outer fascia, which is the thick casing of your electricity cable, but in that cable you then have 3 smaller wires, and each one of those wires has another fascia wrapped around it. In that case, that's what your perimysium would be. And then when you go into those wires, you actually have the copper wire that's transferring the electricity down it. That would be your myofibril. And if you were to play around with the copper wire and kind of twizzle it in your fingers, then you get individual fibres falling off the wire. That would be your actin and myosin. So if it helps kind of visualise the structure, you kind of have this outer fascia, your epimysium, that wraps all the way around the muscle. You then have bundles within that that's wrapped in a perimysium, and then your very last mysium, your endomysium, has your individual muscle fibres in there, and each muscle fibre then has is made up of actin and myosin. Your actin filaments are the thin ones, and your myosin are the big ones. Muscle types and energy systems. A good way to try and remember these is to hopefully remember this table. So you can see across the top, firstly, you've got energy systems. So you've got the aerobic energy system, the lactic acid system, and then the ATP-CP system. And then below that, you've got the different type of fibres. So you've got type 1 muscle fibres, type 2A and type 2B, and those fibres correlate with the energy systems above them. So first of all, if we look at the first column, the aerobic column, when we're using our aerobic system, we use our type 1 muscle fibres. Type 1 muscle fibres will produce a low amount of force, so they are the kind of fibres we use when we're walking or we're cycling slowly, might be going for a slow jog, and they will generally produce a low amount of force. They will produce that force slowly, but the benefit of that is that they have a very high tolerance to fatigue, so they generally won't tire out. So if I said to you, let's go for a walk, and we were going for a 5, 6, 8, 10 mile walk, then it's these fibres that we can use. They're very resilient, that they have a very good endurance and aerobic capacity, and they will keep on going. So we generally use them for activities that are quite long term. So anything from 2 minutes to 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, you know, depending on how hard we're working, will dictate how long we can work for. But because these fibres are endurance-based and aerobic-based, they will need a good blood supply because they will need to be provided with hemoglobin, so red blood cells, oxygen, carbohydrates and fats, so they can create this energy. And because of that, if you were to look at these fibres under a microscope, they would appear red in colour. If you go to the exact opposite now, if you go to the last column, so we're looking at the ATP-CP system. The ATP-CP system, when you use that system, you'll also be using your type 2B fibres. Now, your ATP-CP system and your type 2B fibres are linked to very fast, explosive movements. So they will produce a high amount of force. They will produce that force very, very quickly, which is fantastic. But a downside to that is that they will tire very, very quickly. So the duration of this energy system and the use of these fibres are generally less than 10 seconds. And when we say 10 seconds, even then we're kind of exaggerating that. Generally, this energy system will last, ATP as a chemical in our body will last about 4 seconds. But once we've used that ATP, we then have the creatine phosphate that helps replenish the ATP for another 3, 4, maybe 5 seconds. So therefore we say that this energy system can last about 10. But in theory, no, we will use our ATP in about 4 seconds. That's our maximal effort. And once we start to use creatine phosphate to replenish ATP, we will start to produce a little less power. It will take us a little bit longer to create that power, and therefore we'll start to slow down. A good example would be Usain Bolt. Even after 4 or 5 seconds, he will start to slow down. It's just he slows down the least. Because these muscle fibres and this energy system are predominantly based on a chemical system, so it's just based on your ATP being stored in your muscle, so it's there as an emergency when you need it. These fibres have a poor blood supply. They will have a blood supply because they're living tissue, but they will generally have a poor blood supply and therefore will be white in appearance. And then finally, the middle column is your lactic acid column or your type 2A. So hopefully, if you can remember the first column and you can remember the last column, your middle column just kind of bridges the gap. So your lactic acid system and your type 2A fibres will kind of produce a medium amount of force, and it will do so in a medium amount of time, and it has a medium amount of tolerance. So because of this, we're kind of looking at the gap of in between 10 seconds and up to maybe 2 minutes, depending on how fit you are and how well trained you are. And it's this sort of energy system and these sort of fibres that will give us the burn traditionally. You know, when people say you can feel lactic acid in your muscles, it's this energy system and these fibres that we're using. So it could be kind of going for a 400 metre sprint, or maybe a bike ride as fast as you can for a minute or something like that. Or it could be maybe lifting weights for, if you're doing 10 or 12 reps, that sort of duration, then it's these sort of fibres we're focusing on. We're not looking at the heavy lifting, and we're not looking at the 20 reps, but we're looking around the maybe 8, 10, 12 rep situation. Because these fibres are in the middle, it depends how you train. So if you train to be more explosive, if you train to develop your type 2B fibres, your type 2A will start to adapt and become more like your type 2B. Or if you train to be more aerobic and you develop your type 1 fibres, then the type 2A fibres will start to become more like the type 1 and will be redder in appearance. So depending on how you train, this middle column will generally adapt according to that, and therefore they're normally pink in colour. People sometimes ask then, can you actually have these different colour fibres, so red, pink and white? You can. So a good example would be if you compare a pigeon to a chicken. A chicken, first of all, is white meat. A chicken breast, a chicken doesn't fly generally, it walks on its back legs. So the only time a chicken will need to fly is if it's in danger, for example, if there's a fox. So in that instance, the chicken will see the fox, it will need to get out of danger quickly. So it will use its type 2B fibres in its breast to fly, get out of harm's way, hopefully within 5, 10, 15 seconds or something like that, and then will land again. So therefore the meat of a chicken is white, whereas if you think of a pigeon, for example a homing pigeon that can fly hundreds of miles and without stopping, that will need a very good aerobic system to continuously fly and flap its wings. Therefore, the fibres a pigeon breast is made out of will be type 1 and will be red in appearance. Obviously, that's two quite extreme examples. In a human, what you'll find is we don't have an extreme lifestyle as such. You know, we live in houses, we kind of go to the shop to buy food, we don't need to catch it and stuff. So if you were to look at your quad muscle, for example, there will generally be a combination of these fibres. Your whites, your pinks, and your reds. And in certain individuals, such as your Usain Bolt, then you'll generally find a higher amount of white, or in your Mo Farahs, you'll see a higher amount of red. So you can get this contrast. It's just you don't often see the extreme nature of it in a human. So another thing to look at for muscles is their origins and insertions. So first of all, an origin, or the definition of an origin, is that an origin is generally fixed and it is proximal. So what I mean by proximal, it is close to you, it is in your proximity. Whereas an insertion is generally the bit that moves and is distal, so it's distant to you, it's further away. So if you think of a bicep, your bicep starts at the top of your arm and it inserts below your elbow. The origin, so at the top, if when you're doing a bicep curl, the origin doesn't move and is closer to you, so it's in your proximity, whereas the insertion below the elbow line is the bit that does move and is also the bit that is distal to you, so it's away from you. And you'll find that if you do the same with the triceps, it's the same. If you do the same with the quads, the hamstrings, it's generally that your origin is fixed, so it doesn't move and is close to your body, and your insertion does move and is further away from your body. So with this, we've just got to look at certain muscles. So first of all, if you're looking at the muscles on the back of your leg, so your posterior lower leg, so we're looking at the gastrocnemius and the soleus. Your gastrocnemius originates off the back of your femur, so above the knee joint, and will insert into your calcaneus via the Achilles tendon. Whereas your soleus does not go over the knee joint, it comes off the back of the tibia. Sorry, that should say below the knee, not above the knee. So the soleus originates off the back of the tibia below the knee, not above it. But it has the same insertion as the gastrocnemius. It inserts into the calcaneus via the Achilles tendon. So the bit to remember there is the gastrocnemius does go over the knee joint, and it originates off the back of the femur, whereas your soleus doesn't go over the knee joint and comes off the back of the tibia. But they both have the same insertion. It goes down into your Achilles tendon and then into your calcaneus, which is the bony bit of your heel. And then the main muscle on the front of your shin, your anterior lower leg, is what you call your tibialis anterior. Your tibialis anterior originates off your tibial tuberosity. So if you feel the top of your shin, there's normally a bit of a bony protrusion, a bony bit just below your knee. That's your tibial tuberosity. So your tibialis anterior originates from your tibial tuberosity and will insert into what you call your first metatarsal. So essentially the base of your big toe, and will pull your foot up into dorsiflexion. Your quadriceps are called your quads because there's 4 of them. Firstly, we can break them into a group of 3 called the vastus group, and then one muscle by itself, but they do work together still. But first of all, the vastus group is what we're looking at is what you call the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, and the vastus intermedius. So these 3 muscles, what's unique about these is they all originate at the top of the femur and insert into the tibial tuberosity via the patellar tendon. So the vastus group starts at the top of your femur but does not cross over your hip joint. It only crosses over, or they only cross over the knee joint. Therefore, they are only involved in the movement of your knee because they don't cross over the hip joint. The lateralis is the one on the outside, so the lateral side. Your medialis is the one on the midline, so it's the one on the inside of your thigh. And then the intermedius is the one essentially in between you, so if you think of it like that. So you've got one on the outside, one on the inside, and then one in the middle. They don't cross over the hip joint, so they don't influence any movement in the hip, just extension of the knee. Whereas your fourth quad, which is what you call your rectus femoris, does originate above the hip, so it comes off the anterior iliac spine, and it does have the same insertion, so it goes into the tibial tuberosity via the patellar tendon, but because it crosses over the hip, it means it's also involved in hip flexion as well as knee extension. So when we're trying to remember the quads, if you remember that there's 3 and 1, 3 of them all come off the femur, at the top of the femur, but 1 of them actually crosses over the hip joint. Your hamstrings, there are 3 hamstrings. All of your hammies, called your semimembranosus, your semitendinosus, and your bicep femoris, they all originate from your ischium. So your ischium is the part of your bum that you probably sat on now. Called, if it helps to remember it, think itchy bum. So ischium, itchy bum. They all come off the bony bit that you probably sat on now, and they will all insert one into the top of the femur. So the fact that they start on the pelvis, come down and connect to the femur means that they will assist with hip extension, but then they will continue travelling down the back of the leg into the back of the tibia and the fibula, and therefore are most commonly associated with knee flexion, so bending of the knee, whereas your quads would be extending or straightening the knee. On the front of your hips, you have what you call your hip flexors. So the 2 main hip flexors you have, or what people often call the 2 true hip flexors, because this is generally their only function, is to cause hip flexion, is your iliacus and your psoas major, often known together as your iliop-psoas, but they are 2 separate muscles. Your iliacus comes off your iliac crest, whereas your psoas major originates off your spine, so it actually comes off what you call the transverse processes, so the side bony bits of your lumbar vertebrae 1 to 5, and they will both insert into the top of your femur, so they will kind of cross over your hip joint, connect into the femur, and therefore their main function is to cause hip flexion and help you pick that femur up. Back muscles, there's quite a few, so we're going to look at a couple now. So first of all, there's your latissimus dorsi, also known as your lats. They originate right down at the bottom of your spine, so it comes off your sacrum, your ilium, so again you can see the big origin it's got at the bottom of your back, as well as all of your thoracic vertebrae T7 to T12, and they will insert into your humerus, so that's the muscle we're going to use when we're doing things like pull-ups and lat pull-downs, seated rows, that type of exercise. Your traps, or your trapezius, are called that because of the almost diamond appearance they've got. They originate from your top, from the what you call something called your occipital lobe at the back of your head, or just the cranium. Your C7, which is your 7th cervical vertebrae, as well as all of your thoracic vertebrae. So essentially, the midline of your body there is where they originate from. And then they insert into the outer third of the clavicle and the scapula. Your traps can be broken up into what you call your upper traps, your mid traps, and your lower traps. So classically, your upper traps are the beefy ones that you can see on the top of your shoulders, which most people know as your traps. But you also have the mid traps at the bit in between your scapula, and your lower traps that are the ones going right down to the bottom of that image. Your rhomboids are the muscles in between your scapula, so again these will work synergistically with your traps, so they'll work with your traps. They originate off of your spinous processes, so again you've got your 7th cervical vertebrae as well as your thoracic vertebrae 1 to 5, and they will insert onto the scapula, so you can imagine when that muscle contracts, it's going to squeeze your scapula together and pull them into retraction, and they work with your traps as well. Then the last one for your back muscle is your teres major. So it looks like quite a small muscle there, but on somebody who trains on a regular basis, it can become quite a well-developed muscle. Your teres major originates off the scapula and will insert into your humerus. So muscles on the back, we've also got muscles on the front. So your chest muscles, the three main muscles are first of all your pec major, which most people are familiar with in terms of bench pressing and stuff. So they originate off the sternum and the clavicle, and they will insert into your humerus. So obviously the main movement there is if you're moving your arms in a pushing motion, you'll be using your pecs. But you've also got a muscle called your pec minor. But what's different about the pec minor is it originates from your ribs, so your third, fourth and fifth rib, and it inserts onto what you call your coracoid process. So it's not necessarily affected by the movement of your arm, but what that muscle can do is get quite tight and pull your posture down and forward, and it's quite often associated with bad postures. The pec major is as well, but the pec minor in particular is a little bit harder to stretch and kind of relax compared to the pec major, so just be aware of both. And then the final one is your serratus anterior. So your serratus anterior is found on the front of the scapula. So imagine you're kind of going underneath your shoulder blade. It's on the front of your scapula, and it causes protraction or the rounding of your shoulder blades when you're pushing. So imagine when you're at the very top end range of motion of your bench press, or you're finishing a press up at the top, it's that kind of rounding of your shoulders and rounding of your scapula that your serratus anterior will be involved in. So you've kind of got these three major muscles on the front. And then around the shoulder joint, you have what you call rotator cuffs. Now, a rotator cuff isn't a cuff, which you might think it is. It's 4 individual muscles that will have unique purposes in stabilising and moving your humerus when the bigger muscles, such as your back muscles or your chest muscles, are lifting a weight, for example. So your 4 muscles you need to be aware of are your supraspinatus, your infraspinatus, your teres minor, and your subscapularis, which you can't see there, but your subscapularis is underneath your scapula. It's underneath. So if you just go back to the top, your supraspinatus is called supraspinatus because it's above the spine of your scapula. So the bony bit of your scapula there, you can see that muscle is above the spine, so it's superior to it. It's called your supraspinatus, and will be involved in the first 5 to maybe 15 degrees of abduction. So it's the muscle that first initiates abduction, so the movement of your arm out to the side. It's not necessarily your deltoids, it's just supraspinatus that does that. The 2 muscles below the spine, so one's your infraspinatus, so it's inferior to your spine, so it's below, as well as the teres minor. They both work together, so you can see they've got very similar origins off the back of the scapula, and they will insert into the back of your humerus, and they will cause lateral rotation. So they will, if you've got your hands to the side of your body now with your thumbs facing forward, if you slowly rotate your thumbs round and out or to the lateral side of your body, that is your infraspinatus and your teres minor. And if you do that movement, you might feel your shoulder blades kind of pinch together. So quite often when we're using your infraspinatus and your teres minor, we'll also end up using our rhomboids and our mid traps to pull that into retraction and move the humerus into lateral rotation. And then the final one is the subscapularis. Like I said, we can't see it there, it's underneath the scapula, it's on the front of the scapula. And that does the opposite to the infraspinatus and the teres minor. It will cause the rotation of the humerus to go back in, so it causes medial rotation. And it's these 4 muscles that cause the finer movements of your humerus. So when you are pushing, or you're bench pressing, or you're doing a bent over row, or you're playing a sport, it's your chest muscles and your back muscles and your legs that will produce a lot of the force, but it's the rotator cuffs that will produce or cause the fine movement of the shoulder. And if these rotator cuffs are not working properly, then it can lead to an increased risk of injury. So bones, kind of different types of bones, and they're classified by shapes. You can have a long bone, and long bones are called long because they are longer than they are wider. So the reason that's important is if you look at your arm, your fingers or your phalanges, they're classed as long bones. Your metacarpals, which are the bit between the wrist and the knuckles, they're classed as long bones. Your radius and your ulna is classed as a long bone. Your humerus is classed as a long bone. And then if you were to look at your leg, your femur is classed as a long bone. Your tibia and your fibula is classed as a long bone. Your metatarsals in your foot are classed as a long bone. And your phalanges in your foot, in your toes, are also known as long bones. So your femur is significantly bigger than your fingers, but they are still classed as long bones. And again, what's important with long bones is they're generally used for locomotion because they're in our arms and they're in our legs. They're there for leverage so we can run and we can move. Whereas short bones are as long as they are wide, so they're quite often cuboid in shape. And the main area where we get these are in our hands and in our feet. So in our hands they're called carpals, and in our feet they're called tarsals. And essentially they're cuboid in shape, and it means that there's lots of surface areas for smaller muscles to connect to. So there's lots of surface areas, so that's what gives us the dexterity and the movement in our wrists and our ankles. We can then have flat bones. So flat bones, what it says on the tin I suppose, but examples would be your cranium, your scapula, your pelvic bones, and they are generally there for one, protection. So it's like protecting your brain, protecting your heart, protecting your lungs, protecting your reproductive organs, but they're also there for big surface areas for muscle attachments as well. So lots of muscles connect to your pelvis and to your shoulder blades and your sternum as well. And then you can have what you call irregular bones. Now there's essentially 33 irregular bones, and you've got 33 vertebrae, so every single vertebrae is classed as its own unique shape. And they're not consistent, so we have 33 irregular bones and each one is a vertebrae. And finally you have what you call a sesamoid bone. Sesamoid means seed-like, and we get these in our knees, and essentially it's your kneecap, or also known as your patella. And the reason we have that bone there is it gives your quads and the patella tendon a bit of extra leverage, and it helps us extend our knee and straighten our knee a little bit easier. So, posture and core. When we're looking at the core, first of all, we need to understand the anatomy of the core. So we can have what we call a deep layer, a middle layer, and an outer layer. So the deep layer in particular, we have certain ligaments. So the ligaments can be called your anterior longitudinal ligament and your posterior longitudinal ligament. So the anterior and posterior longitudinal ligament is a big ligament that one either runs down the front of your spine or down the back of your spine. So your anterior ligament runs down the front and your posterior runs down the back. And it's almost like a seatbelt that runs all the way down either side of your vertebrae. And they're quite big ligaments, but you can also have smaller ligaments. And the smaller ligaments are what you call your interspinous ligaments and your intertransverse ligaments. Your interspinous ligaments are very small ligaments that will be connected from each vertebrae to the one above it, or maybe one or two above it, and they're quite small and nowhere near as strap-like, whereas your anterior and your posterior longitudinal ligaments are a lot bigger and different forces and different prevention of movements. Ligaments are what you would call a passive system, so they don't contract, they're not there to prevent a movement. They are there almost as a last effort to prevent a movement going too far. They're almost like guide ropes of a tent. They don't contract and pull back like a muscle does. They're there as a final kind of seatbelt or a wire to try and prevent you from going too far. So hopefully we don't rely on our ligaments too much. They're there for stability, but what we should use is our active stabilizers, which would be our muscles. So our deep muscles are very minute and small muscles, and they're called your interspinalis, your intertransversi, and your rotators. Your interspinalis will connect from spinous process to spinous process. So your spinous processes are the bony bits that you can see on your spine. If you were to look at someone's back and you can see the bony bits, your interspinalis will connect from each spinous process to spinous process, just causing minute little movements to make sure that your vertebrae are sitting on top of each other, hopefully at the best angle they can. Your intertransversi will connect your transverse process to your transverse process. So your transverse processes are the sides of your vertebrae that we can't necessarily see, but there's another bony bit of your spine in there that, again, is there for muscle attachment. So they will cause then slight movement in a different range of motion for the vertebrae. And then your rotators is what, again, what it says on the tin, they cause rotation of your vertebrae. But all of these muscles, these small muscles, are on the back of your vertebrae, so it shows the importance of trying to keep our vertebrae in a little bit of extension and not letting our body kind of slump forward. So these are very deep ligaments, very deep muscles, but hopefully they're important to make sure that each vertebrae is sat on top of the vertebrae below it, and they're all in optimal alignment. Once we go to the middle layer, we've then got more active systems again, so we're looking at muscles again. And the key muscles, what you call your transverse abdominis, your multifidus, your pelvic floor muscles, and your diaphragm. And the way we use these is almost like a pressure system. So when you tense your muscles at the front, which is your transverse abdominis, you tense the muscles at the back, which is your multifidus, you tense you use your pelvic floor muscles, which are the muscles at the bottom, and then you hold your breath, which is your diaphragm. Taking the little breath and holding it will increase your intra-abdominal pressure, and it will make your lumbar vertebrae more stable. So think of when you're picking a heavy object up off the floor, whether it's your kids or a bag or a suitcase or something like that, quite often you'll make the noise like a huh, and that's what you call the Valsalva maneuver. And it's the Valsalva maneuver that increases the pressure around your lumbar vertebrae to give you more stability. So it is a natural movement for you to do. A potential risk of that movement, if you do it and if you're lifting weights that are a little bit too heavy, is it can cause an increase in blood pressure. So anyone with high blood pressure, they might find that they go a little bit dizzy when they do that. So it is something to be aware of. But generally, it is a natural thing to do when you're kind of putting some kind of stress through the body. And the whole aim of this, missed some, sorry. And then so that's the middle layer. We're then looking at the outer layer. The outer layer then is really any muscle in your body. It could be muscles that we've looked at already, so it could be your abs, your rectus abdominis, your rectus spinae, your glutes, your hamstrings, your hip flexors, your quads, your lats, your quadriceps lumborum, your traps, your rhomboids, your rotator cuffs, your pec major, your pec minor. All of these muscles that are generally quite superficial, we can see them, can affect your posture as well, because if your pec major or pec minor is too tight, it's going to pull your posture forward. If your hip flexors are too tight, you can pull your pelvis forward. If your abs are too tight, it can pull you into flexion. So when we're looking at the core and good postures as a whole, we need to look at not just the outer core, which is what a lot of people look at in terms of the rectus abdominis and the rectus spinae. We then need to look at the deeper muscles in terms of the middle there, in terms of do we know how to brace, do we know how to do the Valsalva maneuver, but also is our posture and our core aligned correctly. And what we mean by that is we should have these natural curves in our body, what we call a neutral posture or neutral curves. But to understand this, you need to understand the different segments of the spine. So first of all, you can have the cervical vertebrae, which is your neck. You can have your thoracic vertebrae, which is more like your chest area, your thorax area. You can have your lumbar vertebrae, which is your lower back. You can then have your sacrum, and you can then have your coccyx, or your coccygeal, sometimes known as. So first of all, your cervical vertebrae are the smallest vertebrae you've got. They're very delicate. You've got to be careful that you don't damage them, because it can easily damage nerves. Your thoracic vertebrae are quite mobile, so they're the most mobile of all your vertebrae. If you were to kind of sit up tall in your chair and try and twist around as if you're trying to look in your blind spot when you're driving, all of that rotation and all of that movement comes from your thoracic vertebrae. Whereas your lumbar vertebrae are very, very strong, they're much bigger, and they don't move as much. They almost are designed not to move as much, because everything we do will go through the lumbar vertebrae. If you're sat down now, there'll be stress going through your lumbar vertebrae. If you stand up, a majority of the weight will be going through your lumbar. If you lay on your front or you lay on your back, the pressure will all meet in your lumbar vertebrae. So that's where that lumbar is, they're very strong, they're purposely built like that, but it's obviously as a place of significant stress and where injuries can occur as well. And then with your sacrum and your coccyx, these part of your vertebrae are fused, so they don't move, they are fused together. And when we're looking at our postures, you can see we have this neutral posture, and what we're looking for is, is this natural curve in the lower back, an outer curve in the upper back, and then an inward curve again in your neck. So in your lower back is what you call a lordotic curve, in your thorax is what you call a kyphotic curve, and then in your neck you have what you call a lordotic curve. And we should have these curves, it's just making sure that they are not too excessive. So potentially, if you have a bit of an arch in your upper back, that is what you call kyphosis. That curve in your upper back is too much. Quite common because people will often overtrain the chest, they will overtrain their abs, so these muscles will pull you forward, but also because of kind of sedentary work patterns, such as sitting at a laptop, driving, kind of slumping, looking at your texts, looking at your phone, forward and become or you can have what you call lordosis, which is an excessive lordotic curve in your lower back. Again, this can be very common because what can happen is your hip flexors, if you sit down a lot, which again a lot of people do, whether we're sat in an office or we're sat at school or we're sat at university or we're sat in cars or vans driving, our hip flexors can become quite tight, so when we stand up, the iliacus and the psoas major, which are the two hip flexors we discussed earlier, will become tight and pull your pelvis forward, pull your lumbar vertebrae forward, and you'll end up with a tight lower back. And finally, you can have what you call scoliosis, which is this S-shaped shape of your spine. Quite often, scoliosis is hereditary or genetic, so it's normally something that you could be born with. However, things like excessive forces going through one side of your body can cause scoliosis to occur. So hopefully when we train individuals for posture and core, we're taking into consideration the deeper layer, the middle layer and the outer layer, making sure that all of these muscles are trained equally, that there's no dysfunction, that one muscle isn't tighter than the other, and therefore our client can maintain these neutral postures and they don't have or they don't develop kyphosis or lordosis in particular. Okay, the nervous system. So nervous system can be broken into what you call the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So your central nervous system is essentially your brain and your spinal cord, and it's this that is essentially your computer. Your spinal cord will pass all the information onto your brain for it to analyse and make a decision on lots of parts of your body, whether it's your digestive system, your respiratory system, your movement, your amount of pressure, hormone production, enzymes. There's lots of different areas that your brain will kind of be constantly analysing and making decisions on. But to get all that information, it needs what you call a peripheral nervous system. So your peripheral nervous system is everything outside of your brain and spinal cord. So it can be anything from pressure on your hand, it could be temperature, it could be touch, but it can also be the position of your ankle in relation to your knee when doing a lunge. It could be whether you've just eaten an apple and therefore it's picking up on that stimulus and it feeds back to your brain. So there's lots of stimulus all the time that is being fed into your peripheral nervous system that your brain and your spinal cord will then have to interpret and analyse. And with this, we then have other parts of our peripheral nervous system. So first of all, we have what we call a somatic nervous system. If you use your somatic nervous system, you're generally telling your body what to do. So if you kind of touch the end of your nose now, or you stand up, you have a drink of your water, you go tell yourself to go for a run, that's you using your somatic nervous system. And it's generally voluntary actions, whereas your autonomic nervous system, also known as your automatic nervous system, is something that happens automatically. So it could be, for example, your heart rate, your breathing, your blood pressure, anything that you don't really tell your body to do, but it does it, will be classed as an autonomic nervous system. And with your autonomic nervous system, it can either speed you up or slow you down. So if it speeds you up, it's called your sympathetic nervous system, or if it slows you down, it's called your parasympathetic nervous system. So an example here would be, you tell yourself to go for a run, so you use your somatic nervous system, but as soon as you go for a run, your autonomic nervous system will tell your body to increase your heart rate, increase your blood flow, increase your breathing, increase your blood pressure, so you can deal with the stress of exercise. And then once you've finished running and you sit down, again you somatically tell yourself to sit down, but your autonomic nervous system will then realise that you're putting yourself under less stress and less pressure, and will then use your parasympathetic nervous system to decrease your heart rate, decrease your blood pressure, decrease your breathing, etc. And obviously it does this pretty much constantly without you having to think about it. So if we're looking at the nervous system, we've also got to look at how we actually cause a muscular contraction to occur. So first of all, an electrical impulse is triggered by our somatic nervous system to travel down a nerve or a motor neuron towards a muscle. For example, we're trying to do a bicep curl. So first of all, the dangly dendrites, so the dendrites, which you almost imagine that's plugged into your brain, you'll send an impulse down your dendrites, down what you call the axon, which is the wire that will transfer or carry the electrical impulse, into the end, which is what you call your synapse, or sometimes your axon terminal. So first of all, we need to understand this cell. So we have what you call a cell body. In the cell body is plasma and fluid, and you also have a nucleus in there. It's the nucleus that tells that cell what its purpose is. So this cell now knows that it's a motor neuron, it's a motor nerve. It sends an impulse down the axon, and the axon is covered in what you call a myelin sheath. And that myelin sheath is your essential fat, and it actually increases the speed at which you will conduct the electrical impulse. So generally, the more myelin sheath you've got, the faster the impulse will be. When the impulse gets to the end, either in what you call the synapse or the axon terminal, that's where the electrical impulse meets a muscle. And when it meets a muscle, you release a couple of chemicals. And the first thing you release is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is what you call a neurotransmitter. It's kind of a precursor. Your body then realises it's about to release another chemical. So it's almost like a stepping stone in the process. And once your body releases acetylcholine, it then causes it to release calcium. Most people associate calcium with bones and having strong bones, but for every single muscular contraction in your body, you are required to release a little bit of calcium. So in your muscle, you have what you call a sarcoplasmic reticulum. Your sarcoplasmic reticulum is like a little reservoir of calcium. So when your muscle receives that electrical impulse and it produces a little bit of acetylcholine, it will then cause calcium to be released into the muscle from your sarcoplasmic reticulum. And what the calcium does is it gets rid of two enzymes, or it inhibits two enzymes. And the enzymes are called troponin and tropomyosin. So troponin is an enzyme, think of it as a chemical force field, that covers your actin, which is one of the finest, the smallest filaments in your muscle. So troponin covers actin, and tropomyosin covers your myosin. And the reason they're there is your myosin and your actin want to bind together, they want to contract. But to stop that from happening, otherwise you'd be constantly stuttering and contracting, they are covered in this enzyme, this chemical force field called troponin and tropomyosin. But when you release calcium, it gets rid of the troponin and the tropomyosin, and it allows the myosin binding heads to bind onto the myosin binding sites of the actin, and that is then how your muscle contracts. And it's what you call your sliding filament theory. So when you, for example, are doing a bicep curl, that's why your muscle will slide together and contract and shorten, because these filaments will be contracted and sliding together, so you call it sliding filament theory. So to try and recap that, if you're trying to do a bicep curl, you'll send an electrical impulse down your motor neuron from your brain to your bicep. Once that impulse gets to your bicep, you will release acetylcholine, which will then cause calcium to be released, which inhibits two enzymes called troponin and tropomyosin. That allows myosin filament to bind to the actin filament, When these two filaments contract, they will slide together and pull and contract. That then causes the shortening effect of your muscle, which then causes your bicep curl to occur. All of that happens at 320 miles an hour, so less than 0.02 seconds. So if you think of that situation now in terms of when you're doing a barbell back squat, or you might be doing a dumbbell lunge, think of all the different muscles that you're kind of working to do that exercise in terms of the small fine muscles in your foot, in your ankle, your knee, but the big muscles in your quads and your hamstrings and your glutes, all the finer muscles in your trunk and your core, all those postural muscles that we discussed. All of those impulses are being sent simultaneously down and through your nervous system, so you can effectively produce that and perform that lunge. But while you're doing that, you're probably thinking of what you're having for tea as well. So it just shows how complex your body is and how well it can just deal with these sort of situations and how quickly it can as well. Like we said, that sliding filament theory is what it's called. And then finally you have what you call the all or none. So the all or none law is, first of all, a motor unit is, a definition of a motor unit is the motor neuron or the nerve and all the muscle fibers it innervates or stimulates. So for example, if you send an impulse down your arm to do a bicep curl, if that electrical impulse is strong enough to activate that nerve will activate all the muscle fibers that it connects to. If it connects to 4 fibers, it can't say, oh, I'll just activate 2. It will activate all 4 muscle fibers. So it's a bit like a light switch. You know, your light switch is either on or off. You can't kind of pick and choose. So you need to send a strong enough stimulus to activate that nerve and all the muscle fibers it connects to. Otherwise, you won't activate it at all. And that's, again, just the importance of when you're performing an exercise of doing it with conviction and doing it with the right mindset. Otherwise, you're not generally going to send the right impulse or a strong enough impulse to cause a strong enough muscular contraction. So once an impulse has been sent to innervate a nerve and all its fibers, all of those fibers will contract. It's either all or none. So if we go then revert back to our different fiber types, our type 1 fibers will generally require less stimulus because they're the low level physical activity. If we're going for a walk, we're going for a slow bike ride, it doesn't take too much effort or too much conviction to do that. But if we want to start to run a little bit faster or cycle a little bit faster or lift a heavier weight, then we need to send a stronger impulse, and that's when we start to use type 2A. But if we want to do something really fast and really explosive, then we've got to send a very strong impulse, we've got to perform that movement with conviction, then we start to use our type 2B a lot more. So, hopefully that's a decent recap of the Level 3 Anatomy and Physiology manual in preparation for your Level 3 Anatomy and Physiology exam. Obviously it is a revision webinar, we can't cover all areas of it, but hopefully you found it useful alongside your manuals and your e-learning. And obviously if you have any questions, then feel free to either contact your tutor or bring any questions up at the workshops or the webinars that you're attending in the future as well. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.